You can't hide yourself behind a computer. You can't hide yourself behind a lot of emails that promulgate policy. You have to be out front and center. And certainly during times of adversity, you really absolutely have to be out there. So what people are looking for in a leader and for you to be there, they want that individual to be somebody who will stand up and say, I represent this organization. I represent this division. As the leader who is there, who is present, you are expected to be the person who articulates the mission, the vision, and the entire tone of the organization. And you can't do that if you're sitting on the beach or in the gym with your PC in front of you. Now, you know, I will say that if we look at what's happening right now with COVID-19 and the injunctions for people to stay at home, not come to work, there really has been, I think, you know, among leaders, there has been some real soul searching about, you know, what do I have to continue to be an effective leader at a time when everybody is scattered to their homes. And the decision by all of us has been probably quite individual, but I'll have to say from my standpoint, although I am no longer a division chief, I'm no longer an interim department chair, by the way, guys, this was totally by choice. I love it, not being that anymore, but I do have a position as an assistant chief of medical services at the VA, and I have gone to work pretty much, you know, every single day, just to be present so that people can see the administration that's there. And I'll have to say that the top administration at the VA, which is where I am primarily based, they have also all shown up as well. So be there. You are the person who represents your organization. You are the individual who articulates the vision, who is the person who sets the entire tone for that organization. The second is to be fair. All right, this sounds like a no-brainer. This sounds like a complete and utter no-brainer. However, fairness and treating everybody that you are leading fairly turns out to be one of probably the most important qualities that a leader can have. I'll have to say that, again, in my tenure as being leaders of different organizations within my school, I have probably been most proud of the fact that even though people disagreed with many of the decisions that I made, that they would come to me later and they would say, I didn't like that this is the way, for example, that you allocated the general funds from the school, but I know that you did it fairly. I know that you didn't single out any one division and say, you guys get this much and you guys only get a little bit. You know, I had articulated a formula by which I was going to allocate those funds, and I did it. And this is when everything is going smoothly, and during that dream time that I don't think any of us have lived through, which is where there's plenty of money, there are plenty of resources, everybody's at the salary that they want to be, nobody has too much work. You know, nobody really looks very much at is not. Am I being treated fairly? But I can tell you that when times are tighter, this is one aspect that you will be looked to, is she or he acting fairly? Are all members of the division, are all members of the department being given the same opportunities? And this goes way beyond just, you know, this person and this person have the same job and the same responsibilities. So, you know, are they getting paid exactly the same? This goes well beyond that. So be there, be fair. And then the last is to be aware, and this is much broader, because by that what I mean is you need to maintain an awareness of your surroundings and an awareness of yourself. So awareness of your surroundings, no matter what leadership position that you're in, you are surrounded. Okay, so let's just say you're a division chief. You have your department chair, you have the School of Medicine, you have your dialysis unit, that you are dealing with. You have the hospitals where your patients are in the hospital administration. So you have an enormous amount of structure around you that you are interfacing with and that you need to be aware of. Where are they going? What are they thinking? And here I've concentrated mostly in my talking about academics, but absolutely the same goes for those of you guys who are in private practice. If you are the senior partner or one of the major partners in a big nephrology practice, yes, you have to know what's going on in each one of those hospitals where you and your colleagues see patients. You have to know what's going on with the dialysis organizations who are responsible for putting your dialysis patients in there and where they are headed. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is being aware of yourself. And this derives directly from the physician, know thyself. It's extraordinarily important when you are a leader in whatever role, whether it's private practice, whether it's in academics, that you have a really solid handle on what are your strengths and your weaknesses. I can give you again some examples from my own experience. As division chief, I love talking about growing new programs, about developing faculty, about creating new opportunities for faculty to go into their own leadership positions. I'll tell you what I don't like. I absolutely hate going through all of those figures every month. This is how many patients we saw at Jewish Hospital. This is what the billings were. This is what the charges were and how much they brought in. So-and-so did this much, so-and-so did them. I hate that. Somebody give me the Cliff Notes version and let me look at it, and I'm fine with that. I can deal with that. But knowing that, then I know that what I need is somebody to help me who really likes that kind of stuff, who's going to dig into the details, who's going to be the person who says, these numbers here look so different than last month. I need to dig into this deeper and make sure that somebody is not screwing up our billing, because I didn't have the patience or the interest to do that. So, that's just a very concrete example. But again, be aware of your surroundings, be aware of yourself. You also have to be aware of, and this kind of ties back to the fairness, all of us in dealing with our colleagues. There are people that we like a lot, and there are people that, let's just say, they're not our best friend. And you have to be aware of yourself in how you are handling them. Am I giving this person an unfair advantage because I really like him or her? Whereas this other person, every time they slip up a little bit, I'm jumping, because I don't like them to begin with. So this self-awareness is extraordinarily important. Okay, unfortunately, this just keeps going back to the same one. But anyway, so again, be there, be fair, be aware. Now let's talk about transitions, because this is actually the subject of this discussion. So number one, I think that all of us can probably agree at this point that the world moves really fast. And in the future, even now, transitions are constant and continuous. Again, You know, I can't speak to every single type of transition because they're going to be extraordinarily contextual, just extraordinarily contextual. But let's take the principles that I discussed in terms of keys to leadership success and talk about how they might apply to transitions. So let's think about the different types of transitions. They can be either voluntary or involuntary. These can be either personal or institutional. And so let's talk about some specific examples. Whoops, I don't know what happened there. Some specific examples here. Okay, so here is a personal voluntary transition. The division chief for your division moves off to someplace else. The division chief position is open. You apply for that position and you are chosen. So you have chosen a leadership position. This is a personal decision for you, and it is entirely voluntary. Let me just say, again, from my own personal experience and from speaking to a gazillion other people, that even personal voluntary decisions to go into leadership, to make that transition, is stressful. That's a stressful time. Now, what about personal involuntary? So let's just say that, yes, you've been the division chief for 3 or 4 years. Now, all of a sudden, you realize that your elderly parents are actually suffering some significant deterioration in health. And you are the only family member who is in a position to really be helping them. Well, you know, that may be one of those points in your career when you say, I can't maintain this leadership position and the responsibility that it entails because I have another responsibility that's actually more important. So this would be a transition from a leadership position to a non-leadership position that is personal. Yes, it is involuntary. A very similar thing could happen if you were out in practice and you were a senior partner and came across the same situation. You may say to yourself, I can't take this responsibility for being this leader. I need to step down from my leadership position. Now let's talk about involuntary, and I'm sorry that the first one should be personal voluntary, institutional voluntary. So this is your institution totally reorganizes because they just got a giant grant from the state and there's money all over the place. They've totally reorganized the research program and they're offering a center position which is entirely different than what used to be. And, you know, this is partly voluntary, partly personal, but this represents a huge change in the institution. And so you are voluntarily going into a position of leadership, basically into the unknown. Let's face it, if you were a person in a division and you saw how the division chief worked and you said, hey, I can do that as your personal voluntary, that's one thing. If there's a brand new center and you're the person that says, hey, I'm going to apply to do this, this is an institutional transition, but you are voluntarily accepting that position. And then finally, there is the institutional involuntary. So that center that you headed up and you grew, suddenly a new corporate entity buys out the school and decides they don't need that center. And you are now jobless because they have taken away your job, which was center director. So this would be an institutional change that resulted in an involuntary transition for you. So I think that you can see from this description that, this is very contextual. This could cover a variety of different situations. But let's go back then. So remember, we're talking about leadership. We're talking about leadership during transitions. So under the be there, what do you have to do as a leader during a transition? Okay. Think about those 3 principles I talked about: be there, be fair, be aware. When things are in transition, those 3 principles go on steroids. These 3 principles have to be front and center. These have to be so obvious to anybody around you that people are as much at ease as they possibly can be. So, be there. I talked before about the fact that leader has to be there. They have to be the one that articulates the vision. During a time of transition, being the leader becomes an absolutely pivotal position. You know, think to yourself, what happens when a hurricane hits a city and the president doesn't go down to visit it? The uproar is everywhere. Does the president actually do anything when he goes down and steps off the plane and looks at the wreckage? No, he doesn't do anything at all. But if he were not there, then the interpretation would be he really doesn't care. And so in a period of transition, when people are under incredible stress, they're worried about their job, they're worried about their salary, they're worried about what's going to happen to their patients, they're worried about what's going to happen to their entire career. This is a time where you cannot communicate too much. This is the time when everybody wants to know who is the person in charge. If I have a problem, if I have a question, if I'm fearful about something, who can I talk to? And if you're the leader, it's you. So you have to be out there front and center for everybody to see, yes, she is there. Another singularly important aspect of this is being there. You need to tell people what's going on. You need to tell them what you know, what you don't know, what you think might happen. It's extraordinarily important never to promise people something that you don't know you can deliver. For God's sakes, if things are going into hell in a handbasket, don't get up there and say, University of Louisville's been around for 150 years. It'll be just fine. It'll come back. If you don't know, you don't know. Now, this doesn't mean that you go out there and with being Mrs. Doom and Gloom, but you have to be honest and you have to be confident. You have to tell them what you know. You have to make sure that they know what you don't know as well. Above everything, you've got to be able to say, I am here as your advocate. I am here to make sure that this transition goes as smoothly as it possibly can for all of you guys. Now, in terms of being fair, again, I said, when you're flush with cash, everybody's happy with their job, nobody's whining about working more than the other person, that's fine. Under periods of transition, I said, everybody gets worried. They're worried about their job. They're worried about their job description. They're worried about their job responsibilities. They're worried about, I know that she likes Sam better than she likes me personally. They go out and they play tennis, every Saturday afternoon. Is she going to treat Sam better than she treats me? So people are going to be hyper aware of any potential slight, any potential change in how you are treating people in any sense of unfairness. So again, this comes back to communication. You get out there and you tell everybody, here are the principles by which I am functioning. And I am giving you this job and I'm giving you this job, and I'm giving you this job, and it's based on X, Y, and Z, so that everybody can see everybody's being treated the same way. And then finally, about being aware. And this becomes even far more critical than it is during times of non-transition. During a period of time of transition, again, you don't know, or you may not be sure about what may be happening with relationships with hospitals, relationships with other practices, relationships with dialysis organizations, relationships with universities. You need to have boots on the ground. You need, if you can't yourself go to every single one of these places, you need to have people out there gathering the data for you so that you can do the best that you can to prognosticate about what is going to happen with this relationship. What does this hospital that you're seeing patients at, what do they really want? You know, what are their goals for the next 10 years during a period of, let's say, transition? And if so, you know, how can you become part of their goals? Very important to know your surroundings. And then again, know yourself. Know yourself. Under times of transition, you are going to be just as fearful, just as worried, and just as stressed as everybody else. What is that doing to your decision-making capacity? What is that doing to your ability to look at data and analyze it in an appropriate fashion? Make sure that you keep, you know, your own head straight, you know, while you're trying to deal with transitions. Transitions are always going to be with us. I mean, there's absolutely no question about that. And so if I go back to my slides here, I just want to leave you with a couple of parting thoughts. So leadership during transitions, be there. You need to communicate, communicate, communicate. Make sure that you're communicating confidence in the future, but without saying, don't worry, everything's going to be okay. I think one thing I didn't talk much about is to be supportive of upper level leadership. Let me just say that you know, talking about the people above you as being the jerks, the evil person, that just gets you nowhere. It gets you absolutely nowhere. And let's face it, if it's a transition where you're going to be transitioning out of the leadership role and somebody else is coming in, what do you want to be there, you know, when you leave? Do you want a crumbling structure that's going to fall apart the minute you leave? And your legacy is going to be, wow, you know, she didn't leave anything. Or do you want a legacy where they say, look, she built something that can withstand a transition of this magnitude? So support your upper level leadership. Again, don't promise what you can't deliver. Be fair. Transparency is absolutely key. Make sure that you articulate the rules clearly to everybody during periods of transition. You know, who are you going to keep in which positions? Who are you going to have to let go? And if you're having to let people go, you know, why? And what is the basis for that? Make sure that you are prepared to justify any decision that you make. And then finally, be aware. Know your limitations. Know that you will make mistakes. I mean, know that ahead of time. You are going to look at a situation, you're going to make a decision, and sometimes it's not going to turn out to be the best decision. And it doesn't mean it's the end of the world either. It doesn't mean that you're not a leader, and it doesn't mean that you're stupid. You will make some mistakes. Make sure that you assemble your team of honest consultants. Time of transition is a time when you don't want a bunch of yes men around you. You want people that are going to, you know, look at how you're thinking and say, no, this is not going to work, and this is the reason. You want the people that are going to tell you, you know what, you may not realize it, but everybody in the dialysis unit is unhappy, and they're unhappy with the way that you're taking this. You need to engage all your stakeholders on a consistent basis. Use your emotional intelligence, but use your emotional intelligence as another tool. Don't let your emotional intelligence be the one thing that guides you. And then finally, accept that transitions will cause distress and they will be accompanied by significant turnover. I learned that surprisingly when we sold our dialysis unit to a private company. The dialysis unit used to be part of University of Louisville. Sold it to a private company. The private company, they bent over backwards to try to provide exactly the same structure, the same benefits and everything else. And in my naivety at the time, I thought, well, we'll just keep going. I realized after a year that we had a 50% turnover. And this was not because it was a bad company. People will leave because they say, I was going to retire anyway. They'll leave because they say, shoot, I really just wanted to stay in this academic setting. Not that I hate this company, but I just rather stay in an academic setting. Or they'll just say, it was just a time in my life for change, and now this gives me an opportunity to do it. So there will be significant turnover. Okay, so here's one of my favorite graphs. This is my own graph. And you'll notice that on the y-axis is the likelihood of failure. And the x-axis is whatever you're doing, task, an object, an application. And likelihood of failure, your likelihood of failure to wake up is about 0%, right? Let's face it, all of us are pretty healthy. Your likelihood of failing to win the Nobel Prize is probably about 100%. And the farther that you go up on the leadership food chain, the higher likelihood that you're going to fail. And I don't mean you're going to fail as a person, you're going to fail completely as being a leader, but you are going to do things that fail. So academic endeavors, leadership decisions during a transition, they all have a higher likelihood of failure than if you were not making decisions during a transition. So bear that in mind. And I think that once you realize that, yes, there are going to be failures, some things that I do are not going to work, then it's much easier to accept that and move on than beating yourself over the head and saying, God, I'm a terrible leader because I made this one decision that didn't work out. One final thought. Not every leader holds a title. And every single person who is listening to this talk, you know this from your experience. There are the individuals who every single day, they get in there on time, they do their job unbelievably well. You can count on them when things are looking really bad and they don't whine and complain. They do their job, they do it graciously, they do it well, and they are leaders by example. And it's amazing how people will look up to these individuals as well, even though they may not hold a title of being the head of this, the director of that, or whatever. They are, by their own behaviors, they are a leader. When you find these individuals, keep them. As a leader, this one person may not want to be the buck stops here person, but they will be helpful to you more than you can think. And with that, I'm going to close. And again, thank you guys for the opportunity to lead off this very, very fascinating discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Lederer. That was really a wonderful discussion, and I very much like your graph. I think it puts things into perspective. We have a few questions. I'm just going to go through them. In regards to be there, do you feel it has to be physically in these times and perhaps moving into the future? Technology has allowed us to be there from virtually anywhere. Could a task as always conducting virtual meetings with your camera on in order to engage with your team be a step towards being present and engaging in social interaction, however physically distancing?
I think it's an excellent question. And I do think that in the future, I mean, actually, I think that the whole COVID thing has changed so much about how we interact with each other. What is the meaning of a meeting, and what do you have to have a meeting? That I do think that in the future, definitely, um, being able to connect um, by video is going to be equally important as connecting in person. And I've noticed that that for many of the quote unquote leadership meetings here at UT Southwestern, that the participants are really encouraged to turn on their video, if at all possible. It does, I mean, it is a different connection than the telephone or just a video conference. I think for anybody who's ever been in a grant review session, you know that if you just do it by video conference, I mean, you don't see the body language. You don't see the look on somebody's face. You get absolutely zero feedback except for what somebody says. And we all know how important that nonverbal feedback is. So the simple answer to your question is, I do think that video conferencing, as long as the leader is out there and is present by video, is going to be equally important as being there in place. And let me just say one more thing about that. And when I say, you know, be there, you know, I guarantee you that nobody in your organization expects you as, let's just say, the senior partner in a private practice of nephrology. Nobody expects you to say, yeah, man, I'm going to get there into the dialysis unit at 8 o'clock in the morning, and I'm going to help the nurses put patients on dialysis, you know, to show them my support. No, I mean, and that's not what they're expecting out of the leader. So, you know, so being there doesn't necessarily mean, you know, I have to do every single job. But being there means that, yes, you're aware of what's going on, you know, and you have a stake in it. I hope that answered your question.
I think so. So the next question we have is, can you describe a time of transition that was particularly challenging for you and how it impacted your division and how it could have been handled differently?
Oh my God, is this like a question for a job? Okay, actually, I have so many examples. It's horrible. Okay, so I think that probably the best example was when our department chair decided that he was leaving, and he called me up and said, will you be the interim chair? And this is like one of these things that I had thought about sometime in the distant past, and then decided, no, I just don't think that's me really. But I thought, you know, well, in a lurch, you know, this is, I can do this, thinking to myself ridiculously, this will be 6 months. I mean, I will have to say that, and this, of course, this was my most recent transition, except for my move. I can look back on this and very, very honestly say that I did not prepare appropriately for the impact that this was going to have on my ability to run my division, on my ability to do my clinical work, and on my ability, because you remember at the same time I was also the ACOS for research, you know, at the VA. In particular, you know, when I look back, you know, I think to my, I mean, I did give up some stuff, so I don't want you guys to think that I just kind of took this on as, oh, yeah, by the way, here's another role. I did give up some stuff, I think that what I could have done better would have been after I got a really good view of what the job was going to take, then I should have right at that moment have said, okay, we now have another interim division chief. And I'm not going to even pretend that I'm the division chief anymore. This other person's going to take care of everything. I should have at that point hired, not hired, but I basically made another person almost like a co-chair, you know, of the department, because the workload was utterly enormous. For those of you who were not aware of what was going on at University of Louisville at the time, we had just found out that our president had spun down our endowment, so we didn't have any money. One of the big hospital carriers was threatening to close down one of our major teaching hospitals, which then would have closed down our transplant program, as well as our cardiology fellowship and our cardiovascular program. I mean, you know, there's a whole bunch of junk going on at the same time. And, in a classic example of not being aware of my own limitations and of what was going on around me, you know, I would have been far better just picking people and saying, you're doing this, and you're doing this, and then you're going to report to me. So, you know, lessons learned, but yes, that one was a very, very difficult, extremely difficult transition. I mean, for a number of reasons, some of them which were under my control, some of them which were not under my control, but did, you know, come with, like I said, lessons learned.
So we only have a couple of minutes left before we're going to need to move on, but there are a couple of other questions that have to do with how do you deal with situations where there are microaggressions or unfair actions in particular with junior faculty, with women, with sort of the unconscious bias piece. And I know we're going to have a talk in a minute, but just to have your thoughts.
Oh my God. You know, there's somebody in every division who, just for lack of a better term, is an AH. I mean, it does, no matter, and that's one thing that I never let go. You know, if I heard that this person had bullied another person, no matter, and don't worry, this person was an all-comer bully. It didn't matter who you were. If this person didn't like you, they let you know. And if they didn't like what you did, they let you know. But I never let it go. I would call this person in the office, and I started a file. On this person, and I told this person that this is what was happening, and I actually told this person flat out that behavior was going to be their biggest impediment toward advancing in their career. I think it fell on deaf ears, but I think the most important thing is to call it out and to deal with it immediately.
Well, thank you very much. I think in the interest of time, we're going to wrap it up there and move on, but I appreciate your discussion today. So thank you.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
We can't applaud, but I know everyone is very much appreciative. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Kalapouris to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you, Lisa. That was wonderful, Eleanor. It was terrific. And I just want to remind the panelists that we are taping this. We are recording this session as we said that we would. And we will discuss later really how impactful this will be when we post it on our website and the virtual booth at the American Society of Nephrology. So thank you, everybody, for being aware and being here and having this program tonight. It gives me great pleasure to introduce really a friend who I've known for very long, someone who was a role model to me, although, when I first wanted to join Women in Nephrology, I spoke with Amy Williams and other people, And so it gives me really great pleasure today to introduce Amy Williams, who's going to be our next speaker. She is incredibly accomplished. She's held numerous leadership positions at the Mayo Clinic, at the American Society of Nephrology. She is past president and treasurer, actually, of the Women in Nephrology, and currently is the executive dean of practice, professor of medicine, and a faculty member of the Division of Hypertension and Nephrology at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester. And there are no dummies at the Mayo, because they chose Amy to be the first woman chair of medicine. And she was also elected to serve on the Mayo Clinic Board of Governors and the Mayo Clinic Board of Trustees. So Amy, it's a pleasure to have you here. And this is a time of adversity, and we all have to be resilient and resolve to do better. So we welcome your thoughts, and please take it over.
Thank you. Let me share my screen here. All right. Well, first, I want to thank the coordinating group for including me. And I've been sort of busy the last couple of years, so I haven't been very involved in WIN, and I've missed it incredibly. And I'll tell you, it is an emotional homecoming to see the faces that are on this screen. And so thank you very much. So my job is to talk about leading under adversity. And heck, we've had an awful lot of it recently, haven't we? I'm also going to weave into this what Eleanor was talking about and use some examples around transition and how we deal with making decisions, especially when we know that we may be leaving a comfortable position, institution, and going somewhere else where it may not be as comfortable. And so we'll start with that. I don't have any disclosures relative to this talk. So I'm going to use some examples from my career. So in 2016, I was the chief medical officer of Mayo Clinic Hospitals, and I was having a great time. I'm a nephrologist. I'm a critical care nephrologist. I love the hospital. My people are there. It's tons and tons of fun. I was having a wonderful time, had a great team. And then at Mayo Clinic, we have a tenure for every leadership position, including our CEO and president, and it's 8 years. So it was time for the Department of Medicine chair to step down. And people on rounds would say, Amy, are you going to apply? Absolutely not. Why would I do this? I'm having so much fun. We're innovating. We're having a great time. We're helping patients. Every day magic happens in our hospitals. And then I started to get emails and texts and knocks on the door from other women at Mayo Clinic. And they said, Amy, you've got to put your name in. They have not selected any women to go through the first round of interviews. Please put your name in. So I had to think a little bit, and I had to dig deep and think, why would I want this job? I mean, really, why do I want this position? Is this part of my goal? Do I really want to be the only woman in the room? Doesn't look like this woman on an old board of governors at Mayo Clinic is having such a great time. Doesn't look like most of the people are having a great time. But why would I want this position? And I had to really think through that. I also had to think, why should they want me? I mean, I can't be the chair of the Department of Medicine at Mayo Clinic. And then I stepped back a moment and I thought, maybe I need to really define what I call success. When will I know that I have done it? When will I know that I have achieved success? I had a coach once who said, Amy, you have no yardstick. You don't know when you're going to make it. When are you going to get that position and you won't need anything more? I mean, we all need to think about, how do we define success for ourselves? What does it look like? How do we know when we get there? When is enough enough? And does advocating for yourself and advocating for others fit into your journey to reach your goals? These are the things that I want all of you to think about as you hear the speakers today. And when you go to sit with your mentors and the people that you really aspire to be like, and determine, when will I know that I have been successful? When will I make it? Now, deciding to be being in the game is a really hard decision, because what we do is we think about, why do we want something? What is our goal? And then we also think about, but what do I fear? What am I afraid of? And we have to balance all of these. So when you get an opportunity to do anything where you're going to gain skills, where you're going to be aligned with people that you need to be aligned with in order to reach that goal that you're figuring out, that we all are, you need to think to yourself, why do I want this position? Is it because I want to be empowered? I want to make decisions? Is it autonomy? Is it purpose? Is it to do the right thing? Is it to improve environments, which is incredibly important if you're being placed into an adverse environment, or you're there to solve problems? Is it because you want to be aligned with an altruistic goal that institution has, or that mentor or PI that you'll be working with, that they have? Is it because you just want opportunities? You want opportunities to be visible. You want opportunities for the future. You don't quite know what your goals are yet, but you want to start moving in that way. And you want opportunities to learn new skills. Never take a position where you're not going to learn new skills and be really stretched, unless it allows you a step to where you really want to go and you already have the skills for it. Or do you just want to be engaged? Do you just want to be part of the decision making, to understand how things work, to be up at the podium? Why do you want the job? Incredibly important. And when you're dealing with adversity, as we have this entire year, and many of us throughout our careers, we need to figure out why we want to put ourselves in a more vulnerable place. And that's when the fear starts. It's, what are we afraid of? I mean, when I thought of being chair of the Department of Medicine, what the heck was I afraid of? Was I afraid of losing control? Because I felt like I was in total control managing the hospitals. Did I feel like I was going to be boxed in and it would limit other opportunities that I might strive to be a part of? Or was I just afraid that I was going to fail and that I really didn't have the talent? These are the things that we have to work through every single time. So I did end up putting my name and I got in the game, mainly because most of my women colleagues at Mayo were pushing me along. And I was actually very glad that I did. But I had to deal with this imposter syndrome as I was moving into that position, as we all seem to have to do. And I love this definition of the imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome can be defined as a collection of feelings of inadequacy that persist despite evident success. Imposters suffer from chronic self-doubt and a sense of intellectual fraudulence that override any feelings of success or external proof of their competence. This is really, it's the domain of the high achiever, but we all deal with this. And in an adverse environment, under adverse circumstances, this can bubble up inside and paralyze you. So how do you manage through this? We're going to talk about that. Whoops, I went the wrong way. There we go. So I don't know how many of you have gone to the Twitter of Esther Chu. I think she is spectacular. It is called, I love the name of it. Is it gender biased or do I just suck? So her Twitter is spectacular. And women physicians will talk about a bad experience they have had, how they have been disappointed in themselves. And what she says is that women need to be aware of the serious possibility that they are awesome. And she encourages these women. It's really spectacular. But what she writes about is how it is these verbal and nonverbal signals that we get along the way, all of us get. Every gender gets it, some more than others. Every race gets it, some a lot more than others. And we need to deal with that. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But how do we manage that? How do we get through that so that that imposter syndrome or confidence gap doesn't overwhelm us? Here's some tips. This is how you battle being an outsider or feeling like one because of your environment. Focus on the value you bring, but don't strive to be perfect. If you focus on achieving perfection, you will always be disappointed in yourself and everybody around you. But know your value. Own your successes. Don't let anybody take credit for what you have done. Document all of your accomplishments. And when you've got a tough day, read everything you have achieved. Stop comparing yourself to others. Everybody's timeline in their career to achieve their definition of success is different. Be really, really generous with yourself when it comes to timeline. But don't compare yourself to others. Just compare yourself to where you want to go and what you want to do so you can get there. Recruit a mentor, a coach, a sponsor. Find an affinity group. This is a picture of my affinity group at Mayo, and we've been helping each other for years. Almost every single one of these women has reached a leadership role that they strived to get into. WIN was my affinity group. WIN helped me more than anything. And for those of you who are looking at a long career, a long runway in front of you, lean on WIN for help. They are the most incredible mentors. When you need an academic promotion, that's where you go to get someone to write your letter. They help you solve problems. I remember one time I was offered a vice something at Mayo Clinic, and having dinner with a bunch of WIN colleagues, and one of them next to me leaned to me and said, "Why would you be a vice chair? You'll do all the work and you won't get any of the credit." That's the kind of advice you would get from WIN. But this is very important to get you through tough times. So mentorship, sponsorship, advocacy, and coaching are all so important. And you need to really look for that person that will help you. They'll help you gain awareness, understand capabilities and your talents, that self-awareness that Eleanor talked about. They'll help you navigate organizational politics and strategies when you're going through really tough times and you're in an adverse environment or chaos is all around you. That is so important to get the job done. Broadens your perspective, allows you to build social capital that's so important for moving forward, because it's all about visibility and what you can achieve. And then they open opportunities that you never thought you would have before, help solve problems, and they also help you gain skills. Now, the problem is, along the way, when you're in a tough environment, you need to really do a little bit of self-promotion sometimes to be seen, or so people understand what you have accomplished. But we have been socialized to not do that. In fact, when we were in grade school, if we showed off, we'd feel uncomfortable because we knew we'd get backlash and we would be less liked. And who were the people with the biggest backlash and would really tease us the most? It was the other girls. And so we are socialized to never put ourselves in front of each other. But we can fix that because we can brag about each other. And we can allow everyone around us to take credit for their successes and make sure that nobody steals that from them. By being verbal about it, by sponsoring people at tables, and practice. If you're going to bring up what you have accomplished, which would allow something even better to come of it. Because then you're telling everyone you were really good, you got this done, but man, what you really did was you set the foundation for things to really flourish in the future. And that is self-promotion, and that's wonderful. It's also really important to speak up. because it has been shown that people who speak up are seen more as leaders, that they're more competent, that they're socially skilled, all of that. So you've got to speak up. You've got to be at the table. You've got to do this in order to gain visibility and credibility. But it depends on your voice. So if you are at the table and you are always pointing out the problems, people are going to stop listening to you. But if you're at the table and you point out the problem or agree with someone else who's pointed out the problem, but then you suggest some novel solution and how to move forward, that is a positive voice. You will be seen as a leader. This is incredibly important. Otherwise, people stop calling on you if you raise your hand, even if it's your virtual hand. They'll stop calling on you if all you're going to do is bring up the problems that everybody else knows is there. So it's important to speak up and to focus on moving the group forward for the better of the whole, not just your area. This is incredibly important. And I mentor people that if you're going to a meeting, already know exactly what's going to happen at that meeting. Do your pre-work, read and study that agenda so that you know what you can say to move the group forward. And you can also invite others around the table so they can show what they know too. The other thing is we need to prepare. So you need a checklist. Now, nobody really has a checklist, but you need it at least in your head, what you need to do to go to get to where you want to go. Because you don't want to have to learn all your skills once you're there, or an adverse environment is going to be so horrible and you will create chaos yourself if you don't know what you're doing. But you also have to be authentic and you have to be kind. You can be tough and you can have critical conversations, but you never have to be nasty. You need to develop self-awareness. We heard about that, and that is incredibly important to be successful. And you need to act with integrity, everything you do, and be humble and own up to your mistakes. I love this quote from Eleanor Roosevelt. Do one thing every day that scares you. If you do that, if you put yourself out there, when you get into a really adverse environment, situation, the chaos we've had over the last year, you will have the confidence to innovate, to make decisions that you have never made before. And that's the important thing. So do something that scares you each day. These days, it could just be going to the grocery store and seeing people without masks. The other thing is you need visibility. So be so good that nobody can ignore you. And here's another great quote from Esther Lauder, who was one of the first true successful women entrepreneurs, still is one of the most successful women entrepreneurs. I didn't get there by wishing for it or hoping for it, but by working for it. And that is so important. Nothing's ever going to land on your lap. You've got to work for it. Okay, so I became the Department of Medicine chair. Little did I realize the Department of Medicine was in huge trouble. The institution saw them as not having any accountability. They were not responsible. They were doing their own thing. They weren't being innovative. They were always number one, so they didn't have to do anything more. And it was falling down. And we were not meeting the expectations of the institution. And I was told with my meeting with the president and CEO at that time and the then executive dean of the practice that if I don't fix this, they're going to take over and run the Department of Medicine. Oh, isn't that great? So there I was moving forward. And I went to this book that I've been reading by Alan Mulally about how he turned the Ford company around. And what he said was he had to focus, reset, communicate, and engage. And that's exactly what I had to do. I needed to elevate my game. I needed to move from being a really consensus builder to be someone who had to focus on performance. I had to capitalize on all the trusted relationships that I had built over the years to get things done, to get the knowledge I needed to balance an inclusive and empowering approach with bold decisions and holding others accountable. I needed to identify all the complacency that had happened in the Department of Medicine and the disengagement and get everybody engaged again. If your stakeholders aren't engaged and you're in trouble, you'll never succeed in pulling them out. And you need to act really quickly. You need to have all those critical conversations and make essential steps and changes in your first months to 6 months of being in a new position, because you're still in that honeymoon period. And after a year, it gets a heck of a lot harder to make a lot of those critical decisions that you let go because they're tough to do. And you need to command when needed. Again, you can be tough, but you don't have to be nasty. And you have to manage everything around you, all the people. Manage up, as Eleanor talked about. You need, as a chair of the department, I had to manage all my friends. I had to manage my mentors. So you need to do this very carefully. But the smartest move is to every once in a while, slow down and listen. Understand all the stakeholders, where they are, how they define your role, what they need from you. And you need to tell them what you need from them. You need to understand the diversity of all the priorities, the different competing priorities that everybody has. You have to meet frequently with people. Eleanor talked about this. You have to be visible. In fact, when you walk down the hall, don't look at your cell phone. Look up, smile at people, engage them. That's visibility. That shows you're a leader. You need to redefine often expectations for people and for those that you lead and for yourself, and create a culture of accountability and responsibility. That way you can empower people, and that's what they want. And go to every resource you can to find out how to do things well. So lessons learned when I needed to really move the Department of Medicine forward. You need to focus on, once you get a new leadership role, it's not about you anymore. It's about building the skills to lead that group. Your career might need to take a little bit of a step backwards, because now you need to build those skills to be the best leader that you can. You need to focus on the people that you lead. Data is important. Data is power. You need to have data to convince people, especially in our profession. And transparency around that data, showing it is so important to move forward. You've got to have that numbers person who knows how to analyze things, who knows how to give you the information you need to make decisions. Communication, communication, communication. Remember that when you get a leadership position and you're in an adverse environment and you need to change things, that your relationships with your friends are going to change, because you are their leader, you are their chair. It doesn't matter what you're leading, your relationship with them will change. Always celebrate people's successes, and have a collaborative relationship with your boss, with Eleanor talked about. Make sure that you understand what they need from you and what they call your success, and you let them know what you need from them. But the most important thing is that team. Eleanor talked about it, and you want people around you that don't agree with everything you say, that feel empowered to tell you when you are wrong, to call out your blind spots, to call out your biases and understand them. And very importantly, surround yourself with people that fill your gaps, that have the knowledge that you don't have. You can't do anything on your own. And when times get tough and you have to deal with adversity, that's when your team is so important. And plus, they help you grow. You help each other grow. So the first year was really tough. And then we were in our group. The Department of Medicine had that magic again, and we were moving forward. And then the dean for the practice, the executive dean for the practice that manages all the practice and basically everything at Mayo Clinic, their tenure was up. Again, we only have an 8-year tenure. And when I heard that position was open, it was like I felt really warm. And I had a coach once that said, when you are deciding between opportunities, if your first reaction is, yeah, I guess I could do that, it may not be the job that you'll be passionate about. But if it is, whoa, that would be a ton of fun. That may be your goal and what you want to do. And that's what happened. So this was at the same time we had a new CEO, and he has a new bold forward vision to 2030. We now have a platform partner with Google. We've got all this technology. It's spectacular. I thought this is the chance to reinvigorate, innovate, and reimagine the practice. So fantastic. Got together another team, stole a bunch of them from the Department of Medicine, and we were on our way. And I realized that the first thing I need to do was change the culture from an adverse sort of culture around managing the practice to an inclusive culture and a safe culture. For this team to work, and for the different sites, this is Mayo Clinic everywhere, including internationally, everybody had to feel safe to say, no, I disagree, and to have critical conversations and come to that critical ideal conflict point so that we hear everything to make the right decision to move forward. That people would feel comfortable to state the minority opinion and we could move forward and find a way out. This is so important to learn how to do, which is why it's important sometimes to get on committees so you can see how this is done well, and even more importantly, how it's not done well and what you don't want to do. And then we needed to strive to simplify our processes for how resources flowed, how people are chosen for what, every process that there is. We needed to simplify so we could be nimble and move in this new 2030 vision. And of course, transparency. So boy, were we having fun. And then COVID hit. And oh my goodness, I don't think I left, we call it the 11th floor, the executive suites for a couple weeks, and didn't shower for a while because it was my responsibility to advise the CEO what we had to do. And we had to slam the practice down in 3 days, going from about 500 surgeries a day to 7, putting people on furlough. The impact to Mayo Clinic was huge, but we had to do it. And thank goodness for the skills I had learned along the way and those trusted relationships, or we would not have been able to do it. We knew we needed to be really nimble because we didn't know what the heck was going on, and neither did anyone else. We had to learn from everybody inside the institution, outside the institution. We had a singular focus, which makes things so easy, and it never really happens in real life except during COVID. And that was to keep everybody safe. And we focused on that. We broadened the team to get the content experts involved. We empowered people. With their empowerment, they had responsibility to do the right thing and to stop if they were moving forward and realize they had to shift and go elsewhere. We really resourced the heck out of everyone so they could get things done. And we had that clarity of decision rights, that people had the right to make decisions, knowing that they would come to the leadership group if they needed to get permission or to make sure it was the right thing. Simplifying decisions is important. It was all about communication. Every day, constant communication, talking about the why, talking about why we needed to pivot and do something that we decided we didn't need to do a week ago, but now we have better knowledge of COVID and we know how to be safer. I needed to be able to be really authentic and honest with people that we didn't know what we didn't know. That's why we did that. Now we know more. This is why we're going to do that. And every day being visible, as Eleanor said. Now, it came to a point where we were visible like we are now, but every single day being visible and being present, incredibly important. So we did well. We ramped up the practice. By the end of April, we were already back to 100%. Weren't we great? Well, we weren't so great. and our society made us really self-aware of how great we were not. And to be sustainable and the Mayo Clinic we wanted to be, we had to really address racism within our walls, in our communities, and beyond. And that's where, again, here we are, it's more adverse, and it's right out in the open. We couldn't ignore it. And we're moving forward. We're trying to move forward. It takes everybody to do this. And we looked at some guiding principles because this is really uncomfortable for many people. For many, they don't know how to really deal with this and how to verbalize, and they feel self-conscious talking about it. And so we realized we had to acknowledge all viewpoints and concerns. And our guiding principles were listen with curiosity and compassion. Be really flexible in how we're thinking of things and transparent. Again, communication, and engage everyone. So I also had to look at who has done this well, who has fought through more adversity and gotten things done. Well, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a woman who was marginalized, even though the smartest in her class, but absolutely marginalized. And she found her true north, and she fought for it. And her true north was interpreting the Constitution that everybody has equal rights and should have equal opportunities. And isn't that what we do in medicine? That everybody should have equal opportunities to be as healthy as they possibly can be. And that we can fight inequity in our profession and healthcare inequities. We need to do this to save our profession. And I challenge everybody here to do this. And this is all about moving through adversity, doing the right thing, realizing what your true north is. And if you do the right thing, nobody is ever going to blame you for making a mistake because you are doing it for the good of the whole. And that's what dealing with adversity is all about. And in fact, I'm going to end with this quote, another quote that I love. And it's from Rosa Parks. And I think about this a lot. Making big decisions, trying to pull a group out of a hole and help them be better, is that you must never be fearful about what you are doing when it is right. And I would say that doing the right thing is the best way to manage an adverse situation, whether it's from a virus, whether it's from a nasty boss or a bad environment. No matter what it is, do the right thing and you'll get out of it, and you will bring others along with you, because that's part of doing the right thing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amy. That was inspirational. You have people in tears over RBG.
Oh, I know.
And what a beacon for gender equity and just intelligence she was, and a role model to all young men and women. We have some questions. I want to start by asking you, in my own career, I faced both success and adversity. And I found that having the stakeholders really important. But speak about an executive coach and how important coaching really can be when you need just eyes and ears that aren't necessarily your friends or in your environment.
That is a great question. I'm glad you asked that. I think that they're incredibly valuable. It is like psychotherapy. I haven't needed one because I've had opportunities to have a coach, so I don't need a psychotherapist. But they help you rethink what you are doing. They help you realize the mistakes that you make that you don't even know that you're making. And I was on one board here at Mayo, and I could have stood in the middle of that table and the CEO would not have called on me. And I kept thinking, what the heck is wrong? And the coach told me that it's because when I speak, it confuses him. And that I'm here and he's here, and I needed to learn how to manage that. And that's part of that, having the right voice. You have to realize, who are you trying to influence? Who are you trying to have notice your talent and the talented people that are around you? Once you understand that person and what they're looking for, then you can be successful. And that's what a coach can help you with. She also is, as I said, the one who said, Amy, you've got to figure out what your goals are. You've got to figure out what you want. What do you love doing? What is your passion? And then build the skills to be the best at that possible. She really, and the other thing that coaches do is that when you have a confrontation with somebody, or you leave a meeting or a conversation that didn't go well, you can talk to your coach and they can help you dissect how you could do something better. It is spectacular. It really is. The other thing they do is when they say, so what are you up to? And you say what you're up to, the next time you come and say, did you finish that? Did you have that critical conversation? Well, no. And then they help you figure out how to do it. I would often call my coach when I knew I had to go into a really tense situation and have her help me figure out a better way to approach things so that I never got a little out of control or a little bit too enthusiastic but stayed calm and got through it.
We have several other questions and really important themes that you touched on. One important question is, you talked about creating an environment of inclusivity and fairness. Both you and Eleanor, really the leadership, the mantra is coming through here, right? Inclusivity and fairness. I'm curious how you went about doing that when being one of the only women in leadership at Mayo. How do you change a pattern of exclusivity from within to promote gender and racial equity and equality?
Well, that's another great question. And it's hard, but that's why I say data is powerful. And a good example is in the Department of Medicine, we realized that it didn't matter what your race was, but it mattered what your gender was as far as academic promotion. And that all of the men in the Department of Medicine were having success and the women weren't. And so we showed the data to all, we said we were going to start a new program called Catalyst, where we would help women gain first academic advancement, which is the ticket to further advancement, and leadership skills, and build a community around this. We would fund this through the Department of Medicine, and we would start with women. And if the program worked, then we would expand it to others that also needed a jump start. And when you show the data of the inequities based on gender or race, it's really hard to argue with it. Now they can always say, yeah, but we're in the Midwest when it comes to race. But our communities are so different than they used to be. And it is that constant voice, showing data. A business case is another way, but it's also at Mayo Clinic, of course, it's the needs of the patient come first. And we cannot really care for our patients the way they need to be cared for unless we are more diverse. And unless we have diverse individuals in leadership positions, we are never going to meet our diversity goals. Now, I know diversity is different than racism, but it is constantly having that message in every new initiative that is funded by the practice, which means also a lot of the clinical trials we do here at Mayo. It has to have a component that fights racism. racism and equity in, or helps with equity in health outcomes and access to care. And so that's how you do it.
And two other questions. We have 5 more minutes. How do you keep your motivation and purpose and sense of self when things are not going well? This is a key time where doubt and imposter syndrome creep in. And you always have those people who you think are going to help you, but actually are there kind of not helping you. So you don't have allies because for personal gain or other motivations. So how do you deal with that?
It's often taking a deep breath. It's having at least somebody that you trust that you can bounce things off of, who can look at things in a different lens and say, Amy, do you really think they just want to be nasty? Is that why you think they're doing this? Or is there another reason why you're not being successful in doing this? The other is, if you've got that trusted team that isn't afraid to say, hey, you didn't do this right, this is what you need to do. That's incredibly important. So that's keeping the motivation. The other thing keeping the motivation is, if you've got that North Star, if your North Star is the good of the whole, if your North Star is to make sure that everybody has opportunity, then you stay energized because you want to get there.
Another question really about leadership and being present. When you work with poor leadership or absent leadership, and you just hit the wall or are expected to be invisible, do you move on? Or are there any other skills that you can acquire as a junior person? So when there's no mentoring in your division or your department, because the leadership is not able to mentor and create a career for you, or they're not there, what do you do? Do you just say, listen, I'm going to quit. I'm just going to go over to, Jefferson. I'm going to Mayo so Amy can mentor me.
Yeah.
What do you do? How do you deal with that?
Well, there were times when I went to win. I actually went to women that I had met through I was going to say meetings like this, but it wasn't meetings exactly like this. And I called them up. I gave them an email, and they helped. They helped greatly. Again, because it's a different perspective, sort of helps you rebalance and reset, and how you move forward. The other thing is that if there are people that are jerks, but you depend on them to get something done, and their success helps you get what you want done, then you help them be successful. Because believe it or not, people are watching you help someone be successful. And if you're probably not the only person that thinks that person's a jerk, but if you help them be successful, everyone says, oh, look at that. That was a smart move. Now we can all move on. So those are some tactics.
Thank you. There are many people nodding over that jerk piece. So finally, I think the last question is really a wonderful question, as have all of them. What is the toughest decision that you have had to make? And what was the process leading to the decision? Would you make that same decision again?
Yeah, I do think that the toughest decision was to shut down Mayo Clinic. I mean, to stop our business. And it was really a very tense night, and we sat there, and then it was horrible, because we knew that it would impact. We didn't have to fire anybody, but there were furloughs. It changed everything. We became a ghost town. Everybody was scared. We didn't know what we were doing, but we knew we had to shut down in order to be safe. And that was the hardest decision. And I had to make the decision. It's time. Our CEO then had to say, okay, I agree with you. But it was my decision and my team's decision. Okay, now it's time. And that was the hardest decision I've ever made because of the impact that I knew it would have on all my colleagues and so many patients that need our help and our community. We're sort of the biggest game in town here in Rochester. And if Mayo Clinic shuts down, the population goes away, that all the retail falls apart because we don't have all the people that come to the clinic. So that the ramifications, that was the toughest decision.
Thank you. Thank you very much for an extraordinary talk. It was wonderful. And we have many more questions, and we're going to lean on our panelists maybe after the session is over to address them in a Q&A session, maybe a written session, and also come to our virtual booth at the ASN, American Society of Nephrology. Look for Women in Nephrology, where our panelists perhaps would be able to answer some questions or post their responses on the WIN website so that you can see them. Thank you, Amy. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Our next panelist is a colleague and friend, Dr. Alan Wasserstein. Alan and I were fellows together, I think, at Penn. And when I moved on, Alan has remained there for his entire academic career, and they really are very lucky to have him. He has been on the faculty of the Penn Renal Division since 1980, and his clinical practice and publications have been in the area of dialysis and nephrolithiasis. And importantly, in his role tonight, he served as Vice Dean for Faculty Affairs at the Penn School of Medicine for many years. And it was during this appointment that he became interested in appointments and promotions of women and underrepresented minorities, and in factors like implicit bias or explicit bias that impede their academic development. Alan has published in this area, and really, I think speaks very eloquently on these topics. So Alan, welcome to the panel discussion tonight.
Thanks very much, Ellie. It's a pleasure to be here. I feel privileged to talk to you all. Thanks for your invitation. See if I can.
Just share your slides at the bottom of the screen.
Yes.
That's green. Just move the cursor down and they'll pop up.
Somehow it's not working here. Share your slides.
Share your screen. So.
It says allow Zoom to share your screen.
Yes, just go there. Click.
It's taking me back. Oh boy.
If you put your cursor all the way to the bottom, you'll see that there's participants, Q&A, chat, share screen, and it's a green icon.
Yeah, no, I'm clicking on it. Here we go.
No. Michelle, do you have any tips?
I have
What's
a
that?
backup.
Terrible.
All right.
Oh, there we go.
Can you
Okay.
guys see that? You can probably see on the email too. We'll open that back up. There we go. How's that?
Okay.
Thank
So,
you.
yes, thanks very much. So I became interested in this area of gender bias after hearing a talk by Virginia Valiant at the AAMC meeting many years ago, and got interested, and also heard a great talk by Molly Carnes on the same issue. And I've been, very conscious of implicit bias, although I've become a little disillusioned with it, which I'll explain my feelings about it in a little bit. Slide. So what we're going to talk about is the glass ceiling and its relation to bias, explicit versus implicit bias, which means conscious versus unconscious bias, some of the social psychology, the principles of it, some examples of gender bias which verge on the shocking, the implicit association test, which is a way of measuring implicit bias with a simple online test, and the limitations of that test. And then the interactions of explicit and implicit bias, how we mitigate implicit bias, and finally, how we manage bias in hiring and promotions. And this talk, I've given this talk many times to search committees and to promotions committees, and I think they always find it valuable. There's a glass ceiling at most institutions. At Penn, these are some figures from a few years ago, but at the assistant professor level, 38% were women, associate professor, 26%, and when you get to professor, only 15%. And you can also see that in the legal profession, pretty similar numbers. And that's in spite of the fact that in medical schools and in law schools for at least 2 decades, the number of female and male graduates has been the same. So it's not a pipeline problem. It's been too long now. Something else is keeping women from advancement. Next slide. And of course, one of the most important factors is what I would call structural bias, which are systemic problems that are biased against women. The assumption that women are predominantly responsible for family and children. So in most families, it's expected that the woman will give more attention than the man. This is improving. It's not so pervasive in the younger generation, but obviously still exists. And then there's the absence of accommodations in the workplace or on the academic ladder for this disparity. But in addition to the systemic bias, which is kind of built into the system, is there also some individual bias in the people who are evaluating women's performance? Next slide. It wouldn't take much bias to create a great disparity in the proportion of women at the higher levels of an institution. This is a computer simulation of cumulative advantage in an organization. They postulated 8 levels of the organization, 500 employees at the bottom, 10 at the top. 50% were favored, let's say men, and 50% unfavored, let's say women. Evaluation scores were normally distributed and the highest scores got promoted. They assumed 15% annual attrition until the organization was staffed with all new employees, and they gave bias points to favor one group over the other. And next slide, with simply a 1% bias, a very minimal bias, at the end of the simulation, only 35% of people at the top were women, 65% were men. And it's almost impossible to detect a 1% bias. So it wouldn't take a lot of bias to skew the distribution of men and women in an organization. Next slide. Now, some of this bias, of course, is conscious bias. Just to give you an egregious example, Alice Hamilton was one of the founders of industrial medicine, of occupational medicine, and she got an appointment at Harvard as an assistant professor. They kind of insulted her. They said she'd not be allowed to use the faculty club, no access to football tickets, would not be allowed to march in commencement processions. It was almost insulting. And they never promoted her. Nevertheless, she won a Lasker Award, the highest award in American medicine, in 1947. It's ridiculous. An even more dramatic example is Marie Curie. You remember she won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1902. She won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1911, and she was denied entry into the French Academy of Medicine, which is just appalling. And there was a sort of damning editorial about that in Scientific American that year, saying this is crazy, but that's what it was. This kind of bias is no longer present. Nevertheless, there can be conscious bias. Next slide. The question is, what's the boundary between unconscious and conscious bias? There's an increasing social stigma in admitting to overt prejudice, so people are not honest about it. An explicit bias is reported to have declined significantly in the last 50 years or so, steadily. That could be due to evasive self-reporting, as well as to a true decrease in overt bias. And we really can't tell the difference. It's impossible to know how much of bias is explicit and how much is implicit, because people just don't admit to it. So I'm going to make that point a few times because I think it's a very relevant point. Next slide. Why is implicit bias so fashionable? Implicit bias training has become increasingly popular, though proof of its efficacy is actually fairly sparse. But corporations, especially Silicon Valley corporations, universities, schools, police departments, the New York Times, everybody's doing implicit bias training. What makes it so popular? For one thing, implicit bias is a way of broaching a delicate subject, namely either racism or gender bias, without confrontation. Basically, when you talk about implicit bias, you're saying to people, this is unconscious, it's not your fault, which makes it easier to talk about. And the second important advantage of the implicit bias concept is it claims to reveal bias even when people deny it. So you can get past their explicit denials to their bias. So let's talk a little bit about what implicit bias is in terms of definitions and principles. Next slide. We have the notion of schemas. These are deeply embedded generalizations about the environment. It's this kind of stereotyping that organizes and simplifies the complex situations that we live in, and it gives people control. It's highly adaptive. It's evolutionarily very useful. And we use it all the time, but it becomes problematic when we get to definition stereotyping, which we could also call profiling. Racial profile is an example of definition stereotyping. It's using social categories like race, sex, or gender orientation to acquire, process, and recall information about others. Next slide. And these gender schemas start to get embedded at a very early age. Watching mommy serve daddy at the dinner table, watching daddy pay the check at the restaurant. These are firmly embedded before the age of 5, and they are deeply embedded and very difficult to uproot. Unconscious bias, by definition, these are stereotypes that are activated outside of awareness. They're not malicious. They can occur even with emotionally neutral categories. For example, presented with photos of men and women of identical height, both men and women will identify men as taller and women as shorter. That's your schema at work. Next slide, please. Another important concept is outgroups versus ingroups. Simply dividing people into us versus them leads to bias. There's an interesting study where they took a group of volunteers and divided them to groups of 8 that they seated at different tables, totally randomly, and had them work together to solve complex arithmetical problems. Then they asked people how your table was doing relative to the other tables, and everyone said, our table is doing better. That was logically impossible. There was a random collection of people, and people thought their group was a better group. So members of, the problem with this is members of the outgroups of the others are more likely to be seen as homogeneous, which is again profiling, seeing people as part of the group instead of as individuals. Next slide. And then we should distinguish between descriptive and prescriptive bias. So descriptive bias is unconscious assumptions about how certain groups do behave. For example, assuming that women are nurturing but not forceful. A prescriptive bias would be an unconscious assumption about the way certain groups ought to behave. For example, women should care for people rather than lead people. So one is, descriptive, and the other is prescriptive. I'm sure you're all familiar with these gender assumptions, but I'll just go through with them. Psychologically, women have the communal traits. The gender biases. They're nurturing, nice, supportive, helpful, sympathetic, prudent, risk-averse, empathic, emotional, and generous. And therefore, their social roles should be caring professions like nursing, or medicine for that matter, liberal arts, and human resources. Men are more agentic. They have agentic traits. They're decisive, inventive, strong, forceful, independent, action-prone, risk-prone, systematic, rational, and selfish. Their social roles are highly technical jobs, the sciences, and leadership positions. And of course, physically, men are thought to be stronger, faster, and taller, although some women are stronger, faster, or taller than I am. There's always women that can exceed men in a category. Next slide. So one of the seminal studies in the field was the Goldberg study in 1968, which I'm sure you've heard of in one way or another. And in this study, Goldberg asked his student participants to evaluate identical essays that differed only in the name of the author, whether male or female. And if the essay was thought to be authored by a female, it received a lower evaluation than if authored by a male, unless the essay was on a so-called feminine topic. And this has been repeated a number of times in different ways. Next slide. For example, there's a study of teacher evaluations where there were 4 online course discussion groups, 2 led by a man and 2 by a woman. And they didn't, the gender of the person, the photograph of the person was not available for the course. So in 2 of the groups, the discussion leader identified himself or herself as of the opposite gender. There was no difference in the course ratings between the male and the female teacher. Nevertheless, student ratings were higher when the person identified himself or herself as a man. Next slide. And to take it from the other point of view, if you blind people to gender, women can do better. So a striking example is blinded auditions for symphony orchestras. And since those were instituted, the representation of women in symphony orchestras has increased dramatically. Next slide. So the problem with these schemas is that they bias the evaluation of women's performance. So women and the past work performed by women typically receive lower evaluations than men and the work performed by men, by both men and women evaluators. And lower expectations of future professional competence bias our interpretation of their actual performance. Next slide. So what's going on as shown here, people have these gender or racial schemas. They also see a lack of critical mass of women in leadership or in the highest positions that gives them an evaluation bias. They tend to underestimate the performance that they see in women. It leads to an accumulation of disadvantage, a lower success rate, and it feeds back. Now there are fewer women at the top, and again, there are not enough women at the highest levels, and the gender and race schemas get reinforced, and performance gets more and more underestimated. Next slide. So let me show you some evidence of bias in the workplace evaluations in academic medicine. Next slide. So this is a study from 1997 from Sweden. There were committees that were evaluating people for research grants or fellowships, and they assigned competence scores, and these are the scores that were assigned by the committee. The yellow squares are the evaluations achieved in a totally objective way, based only on the papers you published, what your position of authorship was, first, last, or in the middle, and the impact factor of the journal in which you published, nothing else. And you can see for any level of achievement by that objective measure, men were much more highly rated than women were. So clear evidence of bias. Then there's this interesting study. There were 312 letters of recommendation for medical faculty hired at a large US medical school. And the letters for women versus men were shorter, had more terms of minimal assurance, more gendered terms like intelligent young lady or insightful woman, more stereotypic adjectives like compassionate, related well, as opposed to successful or accomplished, more grindstone adjectives like hardworking, dependable, conscientious, fewer standout adjectives. Women were less likely to be called outstanding or excellent, more faint praise. I love this one. It's amazing how much she has accomplished. And more doubt raisers. It appears that her health is stable. I mean, there can't be fainter praise than that. I actually presented this to our promotions committee, and people became very aware of it. And they really influenced the way they started reading letters. It really does exist, this issue. Next slide. Another issue is shifting standards. So people can shift their standards to justify their reasonable choice. In this study, subjects were told to choose between two candidates on the basis of education and experience. One candidate had more education, one had more experience. When given only the initials, the candidate with more education was chosen 76% of the time, and education was rated more important. Next slide. When a male name was given to the candidate with more education, the male was again preferred by 75%. But when a female name was given to the resume with more education, and a male name to the resume with more experience, less than half the evaluators now picked the person with more education, and less than a quarter now said that education was the most important characteristic. They changed their mind as to whether education was more important than experience because of the gender of the applicant. Next slide. This is a really important slide. This is having time to focus, reducing the activation of schemas. So people are more likely to stereotype when they're distracted, tired, rushed, or otherwise cognitively burdened. So they compared dossiers of men and women. They were rated comparably during low attentional demand. But when they distracted people, put them under time pressure, the men's dossiers were rated higher than the women's. Conclusion, when multitasking and pressed for time, which is the situation for most of us, evaluation defaults to prescriptive beliefs. Next slide. So just to give an example of how this works, the NIH Pioneer Awards, these were awards from 15 years ago or so, maybe more, turn of the century, I guess. In the first year of these awards, only men were chosen. Why? There was no face-to-face discussion about the applicants. The subjective assessments were based on leadership, potential, and risk-taking, all of which are gender biased towards males. There was an emphasis on self-promotion. The candidates gave in-person presentations, and men tend to be more I don't know, bumptious in these presentations. Weight was given to letters of recommendation. There was time pressure on the evaluators, and 60 of the 64 judges were men. So the consequence was 20% of the applicants were women, but 0 of 9 awardees were women. Next slide. In the following year, 5 of the 13 awardees were women. Why? There was reduced time pressure on the reviewers. They removed the references to high-risk research, to intrinsic leadership, and to potential. There was a higher proportion of women in the applicant pool, more women on the review committee, and women were specifically encouraged to apply. So you could overcome your biases by making some of these structural changes. Now, it is possible to measure unconscious bias with a simple online test widely available, and it shows that there's a lot of unconscious bias around despite a measured decline in self-reported explicit bias. The thing is, we really don't know what self-reported bias means because people don't report honestly. But it is surprising how much unconscious bias can be discovered with this test. Next slide. So it's called Project Implicit. It's run through Harvard. They give you the opportunity to take the implicit association test. Oh, it doesn't project very well. It's basically implicit.harvard.edu. Very easy to get online and take this test. And you can take it for a lot of different things. You can take it for bias toward Blacks, towards Muslims, towards gays, toward women and women's aptitude for science. There's a host of things you can do with it. But of course, the two most popular or most used are racial and gender. Next slide. So the way it works, I don't know how many of you take it. I strongly recommend you take it. It takes about 10 minutes or so. It's definitely worth taking. And I'll read you this paragraph on how it works. It may not be that clear from this, but once you take it, you'll see quickly how it works. The IAT, the implicit association test, asks you to pair two concepts. For example, young and good or elderly and good. The more closely associated the two concepts are, the easier it is to respond to them as a single unit. So if young and good are strongly associated, it should be easier to respond faster when you're asked to give the same response, the E key or the I key, to these two. If elderly and good are not so strongly associated, it should be harder to respond fast when they are paired. This gives a measure of how strongly associated the two types of concepts are. The more associated, the more rapidly you should be able to respond. So it's really measuring your reaction times in pairing things. If it takes you longer to pair woman and science, it can indicate bias against women. Next slide. So the biases associated by this test were reported by Banerjee, who helped develop it. She found the majority of all subjects test as biased against people who are Black, gay, elderly, or Muslim. Whites largely show a preference for whites, but many others exhibit bias against their own group. About half of Blacks test negative toward Blacks, 36% of Muslims negative to Arab Muslim, and 38% of gays show an automatic preference for heterosexuals. This observation fits with the fact that women, like men, evaluate women's performances or dossiers lower than men's. Next slide. It's rather striking, actually. This is data from Project Implicit, in which they report bias in women versus men, and this is bias against women. And women have more bias against women than men do at every age. It actually goes up significantly through your teenage years and reaches a plateau at our age 20 to 25 and stays pretty much the same for most of your life and then starts rising again at 55 to 60. But women are higher than men throughout. Next slide. This is an interesting slide on a political slide, basically showing that, again, women have more bias against women than men. Conservative women have more bias than more liberal women. And not shown in this slide, but Trump voters among women had by far the highest bias, implicit bias toward women, which may make some sense. So there are problems with this test. One is reliability of the test. That's the test-retest concordance. Do you get the same score the second time you take it? A perfect score, if it's always reproducible, is 1. A complete absence of correlation from one test to the other would be 0. And an acceptable psychological test has a value of 0.7 to 0.8. So the race implicit association test has a reliability of 0.44, and the others generally run about 0.5. Edouard Macheri, who's at Pittsburgh, said for other aspects of psychology, if you have a test that's not replicated at 0.7 to 0.8, you just don't use it. Nevertheless, as I mentioned before, the implicit association test remains very popular in spite of that. You can improve your test results by repeating the test and knowing what to look for. So there is a practice effect, which again undermines the persuasiveness of the test, but practice does not improve reproducibility. Next slide. I wonder about the real world relevance of the test because the IAT depends on split-second reaction times. Most real world decisions allow for cognitive override of implicit bias. You know, we take our time making these decisions, we don't make them in a fraction of a second. And it's been shown that with time for reflection, biases can be minimized. So what the relevance of the IAT is to actual decisions that involve discrimination in real life, not as clear. Another issue that worries me is the social interpretation. Associating good terms with the in-group rather than the out-group may not mean that you actually think the in-group is morally or intellectually superior. It may mean you think the in-group is more powerful, socially more powerful, and the out-group less powerful. In which case, bias on this test may not be due to prejudice, but to a recognition of social reality. And it's not been studied, but I kind of like to think that the reason women they test as having more bias against women than men do is they are more cognizant of the difference in social power between men and women. It doesn't mean that women are self-hating. So the most important question is, does the test predict discrimination in the real world? Does having a high score on the implicit association test for bias mean you're more likely to make biased decisions? And there have been 4 meta-analyses of between 34 and 167 studies. 2 of these were for race only and 2 for a variety of implicit association tests. And there's only a weak correlation between the test and performance in the real world. And that's fairly damning for the test. So you can't use the IAT to predict how a person is going to behave in an individual case. You may be able to generalize it in populations, but you can't predict individually. Next slide. So does the test indicate that someone's prejudiced? At best, it shows a tendency, but does not predict whether you act on that tendency. Next slide. Misusing the test, you can use it to, you should not use it to guide personal decisions, like should you go into science. You shouldn't use it to guide judgments about others, like should a person be excluded from a hiring or promotion committee because they test poorly on the IAT. That is not how you use it. It simply is not, it doesn't predict real world behavior, and it's not reliable and reproducible enough to use. Next slide. However, in spite of that, it's extremely popular. Google and Facebook trumpet their use of the of training in implicit bias. Police departments have been doing training in implicit bias. And what kind of success have the police had in improving their behavior? Doesn't seem like it's made a great difference so far. No organization has reported significant gains in diversity or declines in racial profiling with this training. Of course, this doesn't prove that implicit bias is not important. It could be that deeply ingrained biases require more intensive and prolonged training in order to be remediated. Maybe we just haven't been training people long enough and hard enough. Next slide. I'm going to skip this slide and the next slide and skip to the next one. So let's talk a little bit for a moment about explicit bias. This is something I was reading a study about a correlation between vignettes, clinical vignettes, and the race implicit association test. And this was done in pediatricians. There was no correlation between the test and treatment decisions except in one vignette. And that I found very interesting. It was a 14-year-old African-American in the emergency room who required opioids for severe pain. And withholding opioids correlated with race bias on the implicit association test. So is this a case of implicit bias? It crossed my mind. There are some canards about blacks that may well have influenced this decision. There are these ideas that blacks have a higher pain threshold than whites and a higher rate of addiction than whites. Both of these things are false. Whites may have a slightly higher rate of addiction. And if people are under the influence of these ideas, they could explicitly make these decisions without necessarily attributing it to implicit bias. These are just explicit, pernicious ideas that are out there rather than unconscious bias. Next slide. Another interesting example of explicit bias interacting with implicit bias is a French study that was published in Nature in 2018. It was a study of 40 awards committees in different scientific fields that annually select for prestigious French research positions. The committees with strong implicit gender biases, in other words, those that where there was a strong belief that men are more suited for science than women, promoted fewer women if those committees did not explicitly believe that external barriers hold women back, like family obligations and what I call structural gender bias. When committees believed that women face external barriers to success in science, implicit biases did not predict selecting men over women. So your explicit beliefs about the suitability of women for science predicted whether your implicit bias would kick in. Implicit and structural bias. Next slide. Summarize this by saying the types of bias are mutually reinforcing. Implicit bias facilitates adopting the false information that feeds explicit bias. Not everybody is going to believe that blacks have a higher pain threshold. You might be more likely to believe that if you have implicit bias. Explicit bias allows implicit bias to influence behavior, as we just saw in that study. And structural bias reduces career success and therefore the critical mass of women in higher ranks, so feeding into both implicit and explicit bias. So they all interact. Next slide. So how can we mitigate the influence of these schemas? People can learn to reduce their reliance on schemas by education, by conscious effort, or by imagery. Next slide. For example, you can actually give people imagery prior to the test that influences how they perform. You can give them counter-stereotype imagery, like imagine a strong woman, stereotype imagery, imagine a storybook princess, or neutral imagery, imagine a house. And you can see a significant reduction in measures associated with unconscious gender assumptions following counter-stereotype imagery. Next slide. Similarly, you can show people pictures of strong women or successful women like Marie Curie, next slide, or Barbara McClintock, who is a geneticist who won the Nobel Prize in the 40s. And that will influence people's performance as well. And this has also been studied in the legal profession. Our great Supreme Court Justice, people have used her picture with a short bio for law students and lawyers prior to taking the test, and it markedly reduced their gender bias. Same kind of idea. So how can we manage gender bias? Next slide. First, we can set hiring and promotion goals. We can hire and promote women and underrepresented minorities into counter-stereotypical positions. That means into leadership and into fields that women just don't go into. This is a kind of affirmative action that's sort of on the defensive in American jurisprudence nowadays. And it's, you know, I certainly could talk about that, but I think if people have any questions about that, we can talk about that some more. But I personally think it is more than justifiable to do that. Next slide. We can have gender neutralizing policies that address the structural bias that I talked about at the beginning. So parental leave policies, flexible schedules, pauses in the tenure track. There are ways to accommodate women's care for the family. Next slide. And then one idea that may make sense is lifelong bias training. So right now we have these bias courses that might happen once a year, and they might be for a short period of time, you're in school. Keeping them going throughout your career and then using a multi-pronged approach might be more successful. Training in multiculturalism and diversity seems to help. Education about unconscious bias, about the history of discrimination against racial discrimination and gender discrimination, sociology, social psychology. And you can do implicit bias reduction. It's not been proven to reduce discriminatory behavior, but it does provide a way of talking to people. You can approach a person with racist or gender biases through the implicit association test. You can show them, look, you've got this bias. You're not aware of it. You may deny it. Maybe you have it. You don't want to tell me about it. Either way, you can start the conversation. So even if implicit bias reduction doesn't necessarily change behavior in the real world, it's a useful lie in that it gets the conversation going. Next slide. And then just some advice for promotions committees and hiring, and for search committees. First, use standardized criteria for evaluation, each of which is pertinent to the expected job. Use a checklist. The rationale is objective and explicit criteria, decrease subjectivity, and avoid shifting standards that we talked about. Next slide. Have face-to-face meetings. It's having to justify your decisions in a face-to-face discussion minimizes your default to your biases. Next slide. Allow adequate time to make decisions, which is not easy in our current environment. Being rushed or distracted makes it more likely that stereotyping will kick in, as we saw before. Next slide. Give less weight to interviews. Interviews overstate our ability to evaluate others objectively, when evaluations often turn on our comfort level, and your comfort level often depends on how much the person you're interviewing resembles yourself. This is very hard to get done. People really overvalue their ability to judge others in an interview. This will probably not change for our lifetimes, but it does tend to reduce in-group bias if we could give less weight to the interview. Root out gendered language, monitor and review both performance evaluations and letters of recommendation for gender biased language, which is extremely prevalent if you're conscious of it. And of course, that will decrease your unconscious biases. Next slide. And include significant numbers of women and minority faculty in search and promotion committees. Clearly, a larger number of women and minority faculty tends to counteract unconscious bias. And as you probably are aware, diversity in any organization increases its efficiency and its productivity. Next slide. So conclusions, I've named 3 kinds of bias: explicit or conscious, implicit or unconscious, and structural, and they're all mutually reinforcing. A decline in explicit bias reported in recent years could be real, but could also be overestimated because of social stigma. Implicit bias, which is easily measured with an online test, bypasses the conscious denial of bias, but it's not clear what it measures, and it does not reliably predict behavior in individuals. It does make people confront their biases, and so enables discussion and remediation to begin. And finally, evidence is lacking that implicit bias training works. With education and structural reforms, such as some of the things I mentioned, explicit and implicit bias can be overcome. It is not destiny. Thank you very much. Happy to take some questions.
Let me unmute myself. Thank you very much, Alan. Really provocative and led to some active chatting and questions. And one of the question is, how would you approach neglect and constant implicit bias from a senior, well-established male colleague? Being a man yourself, maybe you have some insight into this.
This is a difficult problem. We have encountered people of that kind, and unfortunately, the more productive they are, the harder it is to do anything about them. And we had a psychiatrist actually at Penn who we'd invite to interact with people, and I think that was helpful. There are also courses for people. You can send them elsewhere for 2 or 3 days. Vanderbilt had a course like that, and they probably still do, that you can send people to. Obviously you need someone who they report to needs to talk to them and say, you can't keep doing this, and mean it. In my experience, they often don't mean it. It's sometimes the institution says, this guy is a rainmaker. He's got to stay, and you're stuck.
Another question, what strategies can be used to diminish implicit bias so that we may improve the care we provide our patients?
Well, I think one important thing is to have representation of women and minorities taking care of patients. For example, in the dialysis unit, I think we have 1 African-American physician in our division right now who's seeing dialysis patients. And the important aspect of any medical care is adherence. And it's clearly shown that the communication between African-American patients and physicians is superior. So you're going to get better care with a underrepresented minority physician in the dialysis unit, given the large proportion of African-Americans there. And, you know, this comes back to the question of whether you should hire somebody who's got the most outstanding research resume and so forth, or can you kind of finesse that a little bit and get the people you really need? Because the organization is going to perform better if you have more diversity, even if the person you hire doesn't have 100 publications. And I'm really a strong proponent of trying to hire people to do that. And unfortunately, the way the courts are going right now, you can be challenged for that kind of affirmative action. But I think that's something that we should be doing.
Yeah, that's interesting. Another question, how can we overcome implicit bias of women against women? Are there any strategies to approach this? Are we our worst critics?
I have my doubts about what that's measuring. You know, does that women just don't like themselves? I don't believe that. I really think the whole concept of pairing positive with versus negative concepts, and just because you are slower to pair women with science doesn't mean that you don't think women are suitable for science. It might mean that women perceive that men have a huge advantage, and that's so the positive that they see is men in science. But it doesn't mean they don't like themselves. On the other hand, there is this real phenomenon that women evaluate other women more adversely than men. You know, the women have the same bias against women's performance that men do, and that is it's kind of sad. And it's I'm not sure how you get over that. Again, implicit bias training is being done widely right now, but how well it works, there's no data. I mean, minimal data. There's a weak correlation, but it's not strong at all to show that implicit bias training really helps. And that's disappointing. Again, at the moment, I really think implicit bias training helps you start the conversation with people who can't face the fact that they're biased. It's kind of like White Fragility, which I know you recommended the reading of, which I did, and it was a terrific book. And again, these conversations are very hard, you know, for some people.
Yeah, and we have a diverse audience tonight, and that for me is a successful program. And one of our colleagues from industry has a comment and also a recommendation, I guess. The impact of implicit bias is felt across so many industries, across many levels. It's surprising to see when upper management sees the light and mandates the training, how much reluctance and dismissal, and more importantly, lack of accountability is seen and the next levels of management. It dilutes the message to the lower levels of the organization. And how can we change that?
Yeah, you know, I think an important fact, I mentioned this, but people are not aware of, diversity improves performance. I mean, I gave the example of the dialysis unit, but there's another interesting study that showed the proportion of women on the board of Fortune 500 companies correlates with their return on investment. They're more profitable. The more women they have on the board, the more profitable they are. There's that correlation. And that, I don't know if that's cause and effect. The board makes better decisions, or maybe a company that appoints more women to the board also appoints more women in other positions as well. It's not clear, but there's plenty of data that diversity helps organizations work better. So if a CEO sees the light and hires accordingly and accommodates women's needs in the workplace, he or she will have a stronger organization, a more productive organization as a consequence. So it's a matter of self-interest. It's actually a good idea to have a diverse workforce.
And finally, the last question I think is about, this is a society founded by women, and so therefore, you know, there's felt that women are highly critical of other women. And there's a comment I have seen that too many women are not helping other women. It's very disappointing. And maybe women's bias, your opinion on this, women's bias against each other could be a reflection of the high standards that society and men hold us to, and we lay those same unrealistic high standards for other women. What do you think about that?
I mean, you probably know more about that than I do. I can't really speculate about it. I'm disappointed to see that the implicit bias of women against women is higher than that of men. I'm not quite sure, as I said, I'm not quite sure what that means. I don't necessarily think it means that women dislike themselves, but maybe they do have higher standards. I don't know. They certainly are being held to a very high standard. Just the accomplishment that's being asked of academic women in terms of meeting all the obligations of their lives is more than men have to face. And they might be somehow taking it out of themselves. I don't know.
So I just thank you. Just a personal note, when my daughters who went to an all-girls school were in 4th grade, one of the books they were asked to read was the Queen Bee Syndrome. In other words, there's only going to be one successful person in this room and everybody else is going to see to their attention. And so I guess it starts when you're 10, and so maybe changing the curriculum in our schools is something that we should look at very carefully.
America's got a winner-take-all economy anyway, and there's only one position, there's one CEO position, and that person is dramatically more successful than everybody else. It's really, it's a winner-take-all place, America.
Right. Thank you, Alan. Thank you very much for a great
Thanks
talk.
very much. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And I'm going to turn it over to Lisa, who is going to introduce our final speaker.
Yes, I am very pleased to introduce Dr. Deirdre Cruz, who is an associate professor of medicine at Johns Hopkins in the Division of Nephrology. And she has a number of leadership roles, both locally and nationally. She is the Associate Director for Research Development at the Center for Health Equity at Johns Hopkins. And she is also a National Academy of Medicine Emerging Leaders Scholar, where from whom she also was the inaugural Gilbert S. Omen Anniversary Fellow. And she has received a Distinguished Leader Award from the American Society of Nephrology. And she, in addition to her medical training that she received at St. Louis University, she also received a master's in clinical epidemiology at Johns Hopkins. And I have seen Dr. Cruz speak about her research, and I always learn something that blows me away. So I am very excited to hear what you have to say tonight. I am all ears. So thank you for contributing tonight.
Thank you so much, Dr. Curtis. I'm just really thrilled to be with you all tonight and have already learned so much and been so inspired by the previous speakers. So I'm gonna try to share my screen and hope for the best. Thumbs up if you all can see for the panelists. Okay, terrific. Thank you. I think the stage has really been set nicely for what I'm going to try to cover over the next few minutes. I don't have a ton of slides because I am very interested in the discussion that I hope that we can have through the Q&A. So I'm going to talk a bit about threats to diversity among healthcare leaders. We've heard already just now quite a bit about implicit bias, and I will be building on that concept. I don't have any disclosures that are relevant to this particular talk. We have heard, and we've been focused a lot at this leadership conference tonight we've been focused on the experiences of women. And we've been focused a lot on, bias against women and some of the barriers, the glass ceilings, if you will, as they impact women. I think so important is as we think about how particularly women of color might experience some of the things that we've been discussing tonight, it's important to highlight this idea or this concept of intersectionality. This was a kind of a theory or concept that was put forward by Kimberly Crenshaw in an article that she published in 1989. And what's highlighted in this idea is that intersectionality is this interconnection, the interconnected nature of different social categories, including race, class, gender, that are regarded as kind of creating these overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. And it's, as you can see in this sort of figure, that all of these things really come together to shape a person's experience. And no single one of them is necessarily a driver over another. And so while Ms. Crenshaw put forward this idea in 1989, this is kind of an old concept that has been highlighted, and I would dare say that one of the earliest sort of cases of it being highlighted was in this speech that Sojourner Truth gave. Now, she was Sojourner Truth was born into slavery in New York State, and in 1797, and she has been sort of well known and well celebrated as an anti-slavery advocate, and during her life gave many speeches surrounding being anti-slavery. And in 1851, she delivered this kind of extemporaneous speech where that is now frequently quoted and as being titled as "Ain't I a Woman?" And here what she highlights, and I'll just read it. She says, "That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman?" And so in this case, she was really highlighting, I think, what a lot of women of color, and I think specifically Black women, experience, in that this idea that even the feminist movement, if you will, many would argue has left behind many women of color, including Black women. And I think here she was highlighting that she doesn't get quite the same, she wasn't getting quite the same treatment as other women. And so sort of building on this idea, since we're talking tonight about leadership, I think important to highlight what some of the challenges are when we think about leadership opportunities for people of color in academic medicine or in medicine and science more broadly. I'm going to focus quite a bit on Black Americans in particular, in part because that is where there is a lot of data, and in some cases where these issues are kind of glaring. And so we know that Black Americans are 13% of the US population, yet only 6% of medical school matriculates and graduates are Black. And 4% of physicians are, and only 4% of medical faculty. And when we look at the leadership of US academic medical institutions, we see a very similar picture, very similar low proportions of African Americans, including that they only hold 3% of department chair positions at academic institutions, including just 5% who are in positions like Dr. Williams as chairs of departments of internal medicine. And then when we look at in nephrology, in our own discipline, we estimated, and this is some kind of unpublished observations from Todd Ibrahim, who is the executive director of the American Society of Nephrology. We find that there's only around 3% of nephrology division chiefs in the United States who are Black, who identify as Black. And certainly while I'm not sharing data here around like the proportion of these leaders who are both Black and who are women, you can imagine that those numbers are quite small. So again, thinking more about the challenge here that lies before us, when we look at some of the data that's been published around Black American leaders at academic medical centers, some of the types of things that they report are some of the things that we've been highlighting tonight. So everything from experiences of isolation, being when you are one of, an N of one in some cases in many people's departments, or being an N, one of very few. There can be significant feelings of isolation, disrespect, overt and covert bias, as was highlighted earlier, that can be experienced. And then these very differential expectations on the basis of their ethnicity. So if for those Black leaders who are in these roles, there can be, and what was reported in this article is there can be these expectations that they're not going to really do much, that they're not going to achieve the same types of accomplishments that they may expect, for example, from white individuals who are in those same leadership positions. And then another key challenge that a number of Black American leaders in these types of academic medical centers have highlighted is this devaluing of research and other sort of scholarly work that is focused on community health or healthcare disparities. I am one of many people who work in this area of healthcare disparities, and that discipline doesn't always get the attention that the basic sciences or even other types of clinical sciences may get. And so that can be quite a challenge and a deterrent, if you will, for many Black American leaders. And then there's also this added responsibility, this tax of leading diversity efforts for which these individuals may not, and in most cases, they don't receive academic credit for these types of activities. And here, referring to things like leading some of these types of programs we've been highlighting tonight that we wish that so many organizations, so many institutions would have. A lot of times, the assignment or the ask of kind of setting up those types of programs falls on the shoulders of those who are from underrepresented groups in medicine, including those who may be Black faculty and physicians in these settings. And so that, in addition to what often ends up being an extra burden of being asked to mentor those junior colleagues, those trainees who may be of color, and the expectation that, well, of course, our senior faculty member, the one that we have, who is underrepresented, that they will then mentor these trainees, and all of that can certainly, while I think many of these faculty of color and physicians and scientists of color may want to do those things, the burden of that can be quite heavy and can actually lead them to not be able to focus on activities that may help them to advance their careers and do better jobs more broadly in their leadership role. And so these bias-based experiences can certainly impede the ability of these leaders to achieve excellence according to the standard leadership expectations for these types of roles that they may be in. And in this particular article, they highlighted that some of these leaders might fear that if they articulate their concerns, that this will actually limit their advancement or even lead to their termination from the position that they're in. And so these are some of the challenges here. And so when we think about some of the potential root causes of a lack of diversity among healthcare leaders, implicit bias was highlighted, explicit bias was highlighted. I think that in the time that we're living in, between what we've seen with respect to the disproportionate burden of COVID-19 that we've seen among Black, Indigenous, and other people of color during this time, as well as these recent high-profile acts of racism, particularly against Black individuals, there has been an increasing comfort, if you will, in calling out what we see in many of these settings, which is it's racism. And racism can certainly come in a number of different forms. We can certainly see individual level racism, and these can be in the forms of actual kind of differential treatment or discriminatory practices that are directed at a stigmatized racial group. But important to note, I think, particularly for our conversation tonight, are it is the case of institutional or structural racism. And these are societal structures or policies that reduce access of a socially stigmatized group to desirable opportunities and resources. So how might this show up in our setting, in the setting of academic medicine? So one example of the impact or the downstream impact of structural racism is this idea that when we, for example, are thinking about candidates for a position, that generally we develop this pool, this candidate pool from, it's usually developed as a list that leaders who are already in a high position suggest people. They make referrals and they say this is going to be a good list of people to tap. They're going to sort of, in most cases, go to the people that they know. So given that African Americans, for example, in the United States, have historically been excluded from certain opportunities. In fact, some were quite explicit in decades past in terms of not being open to Black individuals. The idea that when a high-level leadership position is sort of opens up, the idea that within the network of those leaders, they're going to be able to think of someone that might have risen up through the ranks and might now be an appropriate candidate for this job is almost preposterous in many ways. It would be very unlikely to be able to have a large enough candidate pool given all of the structural racism that those individuals would have had to traverse in order to sort of rise to the level that they might be thought of and have achieved enough recognition to be offered such a position. And so that places African-American candidates at a very distinct disadvantage, which just continues to reinforce the status quo of underrepresentation in these types of leadership positions. And so, what can we do? What can be done about these issues? I was really struck by Dr. Wasserstein's comments and his talk with regard to this issue of implicit bias training. I certainly would advocate for and have advocated for search committees undergoing implicit bias training, especially those who are in hiring positions. But as was previously said, I think that that's just a starting point. I view implicit bias training as just a way of raising awareness of the biases that we all hold, and it is not by any means a solution. I almost get a little nervous in recent days when I see that everyone is doing this, because I think it's just scratching the surface and not really getting at it kind of making changes. And so I think that second bullet point here of that there's such importance that we should place on interventions, and not just sort of, once we've identified that all of us have biases, then we should take steps to break our bias habit. And so this turns to some of the work of Molly Carnes, Dr. Molly Carnes, who was mentioned earlier, who has done work around this. And for those of you that are adult nephrologists or working in kind of adult divisions of nephrology, you may be familiar with her work, where she has been leading this program called BRIM, which is a bias reduction in internal medicine intervention that around 20 different departments of medicine are enrolled in, and that really is focused on actions. What can be done to actually break that habit that all of us have? We've all, to some degree, we all have these biases, and the work comes in when we figure out ways to deliberately change the actions that we take that can be as a consequence of our bias. And so focusing on that, I think, is going to get us a lot farther than just doing the sort of awareness building around implicit bias. We have to hold leaders accountable for diversity efforts in their units and the sponsorship of junior physicians and faculty. When I speak of accountability, I mean that these things should be tied to their bonus structures. It should be tied to their advancement. And if it's not, then we really can't I think, reasonably expect there to be much action at the level of leadership. And then I think it's really important, and this is something that Dr. Don Wesson and I tried to highlight in this article that we wrote for C. Jason a couple of years ago, is that we really should be offering opportunities such as leadership internships that target groups that have been underrepresented in leadership historically. A key challenge because of that, again, decades of being systematically excluded from different opportunities, is that for many people, they really can't even imagine being in a role like this. They know no one who they share identities with, who is in proximity to them, to be able to look to and say, I could see myself in a role like that. And so not just having those types of people in those roles. I think we should put our energy around diversifying people in leadership positions, but for those that may be more junior, giving them those opportunities to try out some of these leadership roles through internships, I think is an important way forward. Collaboration with regional and national networks that promote professional success, particularly for underrepresented in medicine individuals, I think is really key. I hear, as I'm sure most of you do as well, of different healthcare organizations, particularly in this time that we're living in, trying to stand up all sorts of programs. But there are existing models out there that I think we can capitalize on, such that we don't have to reinvent the wheel in this work. And then developing a much more robust national and international database of healthcare and research leadership diversity. I think when we think about when we're having an opportunity for those of us that are in a position to nominate people for different roles, being able to actually find them and identify them and making that easier. And so I think WIN can do that. I think ASN can do that. I think there are a number of organizations that we're a part of that can actually serve as a source for this, so that no one could credibly say, well, we couldn't find anyone. We couldn't find any women. We couldn't find any underrepresented minorities. And so I think these are some steps that we can take. I touched on the idea of the minority tax, which is something that certainly shows up for both women particularly women who are working in a setting where they may be one of few women in that setting. They may be asked to serve on search committees. They may be asked to mentor, particularly junior women. My colleague, Dr. Roy Ziegelstein, and I published this piece about a year ago, where we tried to highlight that this concept that Dr. Ziegelstein sort of coined of the majority subsidy. And here, what we're referring to is that by assigning roles and responsibilities of diversity champions on the basis of gender, race, ethnicity, or sexual orientation, can actually create this counterpart of the minority tax. And that is a majority subsidy, right? So not only are these minoritized groups being taxed, but their counterparts are actually getting subsidized. And here, what we were referring to is that this situation provides some persons with the time and the opportunity to devote to their career advancement that the others, the minoritized groups, don't have. And that actually can contribute to this vicious cycle that inhibits the progress of diversity and inclusion. And so important that we all own these issues of diversity and inclusion. And that, the champions of diversity that are in the room shouldn't only be those that have an identity that has left them being a minority. I think that is so key if we're going to move this work forward. And so for those that may find themselves threatened in their setting that they're in, I just wanted to offer, I think, a few pearls from some of the things that I've learned and observed. So I would say the first thing is I would definitely recommend identifying and cultivating your support network. We're here tonight. I think this is a wonderful support network, and would encourage you to to make connections here and also to continue to make connections so that you will never feel isolated. For me, it's been interesting. So social media has actually helped me to sort of expand my network in ways that I don't think I would have imagined that it could have. And so for those that are comfortable with social media, I encourage you to think about that as well as a way to kind of find your people, find people that are like-minded and care about some of the same things that you care about, and also people that may be experiencing some of the same challenges that you are, who can support you. I would recommend just constantly seeking out inspiration. Tonight has been very inspirational for me. I try to read as much as I can about the stories of people who have had led inspirational journeys. I think it's so important for us to be able to stay motivated in what can be tough, being women, and I would say, dare say that having some of those some of that intersectionality that I spoke of earlier may even be a greater challenge. And so seeking out inspiration, I think, is so key. I would encourage you and advise you that just because you haven't seen someone with whom you share identities in a certain role, a certain leadership role, that by no means means that you can't excel at that role. One of our senior women faculty or senior leaders at Johns Hopkins some years ago spoke about that she, because she had never seen a woman in a department chair role that, up close, and that one that she knew quite well, she just really couldn't imagine what it would be like to be in that role. And one of the things that she highlighted that she learned when she became department chair, and in her case, she was chair of the Department of Surgery, was that you can make that role fit you and your leadership style. You may have seen it done in a certain way, but that doesn't mean that it can't be changed. And under your leadership, it can. And you can actually reshape things, and you have that within your sort of nexus of control and opportunity to do that. And so that was I think really eye-opening for me. I would advise all of you to be ready for unexpected leadership opportunities that align with your talents and your interests. While I could certainly draw upon more recent experiences, perhaps one of the more poignant experiences of this for me came actually when I was a high school student. So I'm from the great state of Virginia, and I was very active in student government as a high school student, and had an opportunity to run for vice president of the Virginia Student Council Association. So this sort of state level position. And so I put together my campaign materials. My father is a very handy person, and so he had built this kind of a little sort of a campaign prop that had my slogan on it, which was "Take a cruise in the right direction. Vote Deidre Cruz for vice president." Okay. And so my father had built this little ship out of some kind of steady material, and it had the slogan on it, and we had a song to the tune of Gilligan's Isle, for those that recall that song. And we had we'd gone to the state capitol, and we were ready to I was all set to run for vice president. Well, when I got there, I learned that there were 5 other vice presidential candidates, but there was a person running for president unopposed. And so I talked it over with my other classmates and our faculty advisor that was with us, and decided, hey, why not? Well, I think I should run for president. So we scrubbed Vice off of all the campaign materials, including the Gilligan's Isle ship, and I ran for president and was successful and was elected. And so that's just one example of kind of being ready for these opportunities. They don't necessarily always come, in my experience anyway, in that kind of linear way that you hope that they do, like just when you think in your mind that you're exactly ready for certain things. Make yourself ready for those opportunities as they come up. And so I think also important to ask for the support and the resources that you need to be effective. One of the things that I've often heard many women and also faculty of color highlight is that who've gotten into certain leadership roles is that sometimes they've been under-resourced in those roles, and sometimes they were sort of given this leadership position but not given the financial support that they needed, not given the administrative support, the personnel that they needed to actually be successful in that role. And that ended up in some cases tanking people's careers because they weren't able to perform well. And so it ended up, of course, looking like a poor reflection on their leadership style. And so definitely would advise asking for those things. And if you're not clear on what to ask for, seek advice from trusted advisors who are in leadership roles currently or have been in those sorts of roles to find out what types of things they requested. And I would dare say here to think about asking people who may not share some of the identities that you have and may not have encountered some of the barriers that you have. And so for me, it's been important to seek the advice of some of my white male mentors and sponsors to say, well, what would you ask for in this position? And sometimes there are things that I would not have even imagined requesting. And so that's been really helpful. And then when you're in a leadership role, when you find yourself in one, be the leader you wish had supported your career advancement. We've been talking about this a lot tonight about the importance of women supporting women. And I think that just cannot be underscored. That once you're in that role, that certainly taking the opportunity to kind of be better at supporting those people who are junior to you and will be coming along. And then finally, my advice would be to take care of the leader, and by that I mean taking care of you. Self-care is so key. This time that we're all living through has been, I think, particularly stressful for many of us, balancing so many different challenges, and it's just so important that we give ourselves enough grace and make sure that we're doing things to kind of be restored and be able to kind of fight another day through all the work that we have before us. And so that is my final slide. I thank you, and I will unshare, and I'm happy to take some questions.
So we have actually a number of questions, and I'm going to try and just start throwing them at you. We'll see how we do. And don't really want to start off with negatives, but I think it's important. How do you gain prioritization for this issue without becoming a target or a troublemaker?
There's a problem with the screen?
Is this me or is it?
No,
I've been having issues, but
Deidre is frozen, so.
She may be having to reconnect. Oh,
now
there you are.
back.
I've had issues all night myself, so. Did you hear the question?
I did. Okay. I heard you say you don't want to start with something negative, but
this is important because I think it's practical. The question is, how do you gain prioritization for this issue without becoming a target or a troublemaker?
Yeah, so I think this is it's a tough thing to thread sometimes. What I've tried to do is to use logic. I think, I think one of the observations that I've made is that when you go to people with data, that can be impactful, particularly in the science field, that we tend to be responsive to data. I very rarely talk about these types of issues, for example, without citations of things because of the expected pushback that maybe they're not true or maybe they're sort of opinion based. So I think that's important. I think also approaching it with always approaching these conversations with humility around maybe, understanding that you won't necessarily understand that person's perspective and also you don't necessarily understand what they themselves may have gone through professionally, or personally, that actually may even line up with a lot of these issues that you care about. And so, so I try to approach it with humility and curiosity, to try to understand what those leaders that I may be trying to influence, sort of what their vantage point is, and then to try to make incremental change. I think sometimes when we see these big issues that we want to sort of go in and say we need a complete overhaul, and unfortunately that's not how our systems work. And so making kind of incremental change and deciding where you want to focus first on as far as trying to gain support, I think is important.
So we have another question here. Does the executive leader levels in academic institutions consult with other commercial executive level organizations like Executive Leadership Council to seek similarities in their women leadership challenges and solutions to overcome them? Wall Street issues sound very similar, and seeking common ground could increase brainstorming to solve.
Yeah, and I'm sure if other panelists want to chime in on this, I mean, I would say, I think sometimes, I think is the short answer, there is a very substantial body of literature, particularly in the business sector, around, as Dr. Wasserstein was highlighting earlier, highlighting the benefits of diversity for the bottom line, even in the business space. And so I think the astute leaders in academic medicine do turn to and read that literature. Sometimes this can be an opportunity for those of us that might have a more personal interest or a personal stake in promoting diversity and inclusion to take that information to them, to share those kind of articles. I've sent my department chair, for example, a number of different articles that he happily reads, but we can be a resource in that regard, I think.
So there's another question. How do we address the issue of isolation more forcefully? And this might be particularly relevant to those who are in a leadership position and trying to grow, the support.
So the question is issue of isolation as a leader, or maybe
I would say, well, Eleanor, you asked the question. Why don't you?
Yeah. Okay. So no, this is I think the very, very important issue that you brought up, and that other people have alluded to, which is, if you are the only Black woman in the room, if you are the only woman in the room, if you're the only Black in the room, I mean that there's that discomfort. I can say that, my own daughter, who does computer programming, had actually graduated from MIT and was quite qualified to do this. But once she got into the field, she actually almost quit because there were so few women. And of course, I know that everybody here has probably heard about the shall we say, the not very nice social environment, for women who write programs for video games, which is what she does. So this, I mean, she came right out and said it. She felt isolated. And so I can imagine that, again, if you're the only Black woman in the entire room, how do you, what can we do to really address that problem more forcefully and more effectively? Yeah,
so I think for those that are in leadership roles who are in a position to hire people, so that is not the case, I think important. What I have so appreciated, I can say personally, is when I've been in those kinds of rooms, is when an ally sort of speaks up when some issue comes up surrounding diversity and inclusion. And so it's such that I don't always have to be the one to say that. And I think it's a wonderful thing, and it sort of does alleviate some of that burden for me. And so I think the hiring piece I think is so key, and then I think promoting this sort of allyship is really key. And that I see that not just when you're in the room, but we think about some of these committees, these diversity councils and task force on diversity. Those should not only be comprised of people who are underrepresented in medicine and science. We at Johns Hopkins, I chair our diversity council for our Department of Medicine, and I tell people all the time that we're the diversity council, and we are a diverse council, meaning that we have white males on our council. We have, it's not just the group of us who are from, or a subsample of those of us who are from groups underrepresented in medicine. I think that is so key for moving us forward.
So another question is, in case of situations where there aren't enough women in a field to pick from, can an active, disproportionately higher representation of women in leadership positions in that field have any detrimental effect on how they are perceived by their peers?
I think if I'm understanding that question correctly, I think, is that a fear of how the perception that maybe those women who are in leadership roles are there because of affirmative action? Is that how I'm going to look to the panel and see if that's what you all think?
So this was a question that came in from the participants. So I'm not entirely sure, but I think that you could speak to that issue. I mean,
yeah.
Is
And
there
maybe that
a
person
downside?
could clarify it maybe in the Q&A box as well. But yeah, I think I think that would be a good problem to tackle. Is the first thing. If we did have this imbalance of women in leadership roles versus those that are not, I think if those women are well qualified to be in those leadership roles, then awesome.
Well,
and
maybe,
perhaps they can, yeah.
Maybe ask it in a different way. If you saw a panel that had, a disproportionate number of African-American women, would that somehow say, okay, we're done. We don't need to be worried about those more junior. I mean, it could have that kind of an effect.
Okay, now that's an interesting, okay, so that maybe that's the way that they're asking it. So we've already made it kind of perception. So, and I have to say, there was some of that perception when our nation had its first African-American president. And there a little bit of, this in some sectors, this thought that, well, what are the Black people complaining about? We have Obama, right? And so there can be, I think in some cases, this false assurance that when you see an exemplar, if you will, in a certain role, to think that those inequities are not still there. And so, yeah, I think the onus is on us to keep sounding the alarm that no, these issues are still in existence.
So we actually don't have a whole lot more time, but I'm trying to pick a really good question here. And they're all different and hard to choose from. Let me do something a little bit different and say, you mentioned that you called upon your white male colleagues to help you out. I wonder about the question of people of color being asked to mentor all the time, as if there is no role for someone who doesn't look like them to be a mentor, and in some ways maybe excuses somebody from taking on that, minority tax, in a sense, by taking on the challenge of mentoring. And I wonder if you had thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that there for sure is a role, and I think we should encourage that by not only for those of us that are in leadership positions who may be, for example, perhaps we're advising a woman or underrepresented minority faculty member or trainee, that our go-to should not always be someone who has an identity, who has that sort of same gender or same race or ethnic identity as that person, and we should really think more broadly about who we're tapping. I have to say that when I have reached out to I'll specifically even focus on some of my white male colleagues, when I have reached out to them to say, hey, can you mentor this this Black internal medicine resident they are more than happy to do so. And several of them have actually said, you know, people don't usually ask me to do this, but I'm happy to, you know. And so I think there is untapped support that we really should be trying to garner, and it does alleviate some of the for sure some of that tax. I would say on the flip side, we as women, and I know and many of us here tonight are women of color, we should also, in our seeking of mentors and sponsors, be aware that we should be very broad in terms of who we are willing to be mentored and sponsored by. I have gotten some wonderful mentorship from people who I share identities with and people who I don't. And sometimes it's different, because sometimes if they have had a different lived experience, then that means that their perspective is just very different. And like I use as an example, the types of things that they may say, you should go and ask for it. It can be really key. Yeah, I mean, I owe my associate vice chair role in my department to a white male colleague who saw that there were all these vice chair positions popping up in my department, and he was like, "You should be a vice chair," you know. And I said, "Oh, really?" And he was like, "Well, you're doing this work. You're leading this diversity council. You should be a vice chair." And so I went in and put together a little proposal around it, and it worked out. And so I think both groups can play a role there.
Well, I think in the interest of time, we're probably going to have to stop it here, but I do think, Ellie, I'll turn it over to you to close, but we do have another meet and greet for those who are able to join. And I apologize that we couldn't quite get to all of the questions. We probably need to do this again next year.
I mean, it was just an amazing evening. I'm not on social media. I mean, I'm getting bombed with tweets here about how wonderful this meeting was, the panelists. I'm even retweeting and tweeting my own. And I think that the message here is that, you know, we are all allies in this acknowledgement of moving forward and creating not only a safe space, but mentoring our colleagues regardless of gender, color, race, etc. And I think that this was tonight a home run, achieving all our goals. And I want to thank the Executive Council and all the counselors. You met them earlier today. I particularly want to thank Michelle Reault, who really put together the Zoom platform and spent hours and hours. It was a labor of love, Michelle, and thank you very much. Kudos to you and to my co-chair, Lisa and Curtis. And to the panelists, you were amazing. You were eloquent, you were on point, and you were in the moment, which I think is really important as well. So we act now, it's in the moment. And so I want to thank everyone for participating. I welcome you to join Women in Nephrology, whether you're a woman, a nephrologist, or just somebody who's really interested in these issues. We're going to be having continued conversations at the booth, the virtual booth at the American Society of Nephrology. You just go into the booth section and pick WIN, Women in Nephrology, and we will continue to have these discussions and professional development seminars, ideas on research and career development, mentoring, and coaching, which I think is also very important and very interesting. So thank you all, and I hope you'll join us in the meet and greet at the end of this meeting at 9 o'clock. Good night.
So Michelle, do you want to, does everyone
Michelle,
know
you
how
should
to
have the
reach?
last word.
Yes, you should.
I put the link for the meet and greet in the chat if anyone wants to grab that quick before I shut the meeting down. And then it'll probably take me just 2 or 3 minutes to get the meet and greet back up again. So we'll do the same thing we did last time. We'll introduce ourselves and then we'll have some time for discussion. And now, boy, do we have a lot to talk about. So we'll see you in a few minutes. Thanks. Good night, everybody.
Thank you. Good night. Yep.